Hey friends, tonight we're heading somewhere colder, quieter, and much, much deeper. Welcome to the medieval graveyard, your new office, if you were unlucky enough to dig holes for the dead. This isn't the world of knights and castles, it's the world beneath them. A world of dirt, silence, and things best left unspoken. Forget swords, you get a shovel. Forget glory, you get back pain. And if you're lucky, a rat that doesn't steal your lunch. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if grave digging by candlelight is your idea of fun. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, wrap up warm, and let's begin. 6 feet under. When people go home, I grab my shovel. That's how my day begins. Not with a sunrise, not with a rooster, with a breeze that smells like moss and regret. With footsteps echoing between gravestones and the familiar creak of a gate that hasn't known oil since the last plague. I don't wear a uniform. No shiny boots or embroidered tabard. Just a coat that's more patch than fabric, and boots that squish in places they shouldn't. My hands? Permanently stained with earth. My fingernails? They gave up trying to stay clean years ago. You see, most jobs start when life starts. Mine begins where life ends. When the church bells toll their last for the day, and candles are snuffed out behind wooden shutters, that's when I climb the hill. That's when the real quiet begins. Not peaceful quiet. The kind that presses against your ears, makes you wonder if someone, or something, is breathing just behind you. No one talks to the gravedigger. People nod, sometimes. The brave ones. The others look away, as if I might drag them into the next plot early. I don't blame them. My job isn't charming. It's not noble. It's necessary. The ground doesn't dig itself. And it doesn't care if I'm tired, or cold, or haven't eaten since yesterday's half loaf of bread and mystery stew. The work is the same, always the same. I carry a lantern, not because I'm scared of the dark. The dark and I are on familiar terms. I carry it because the light helps me see where not to fall. There are holes out here, some dug, some waiting. I know where most of them are. Most. Tonight, the air is damp. The kind of damp that sticks to your spine and makes your teeth feel itchy. The grass is slick, the mud unforgiving. And somewhere in the distance, an owl calls, like it knows something you don't. I pass old stones on my way in. Some crooked, some split, some so worn the names are gone. I greet them anyway, out of habit, out of respect, out of the uneasy hope that maybe, just maybe, if I keep them company, they'll return the favour. You'd think working with the dead would feel lonely. But it's not the dead that make you feel alone. It's coming back down the hill at dawn, passing by homes where fires are just being lit and bread is just going in the oven, and realizing, again, that your day ends before theirs begins. That you live in reverse. That your job is to dig a space where someone else's name will go, then climb back into the world like nothing happened. And tomorrow, you do it again. If the ground hasn't frozen, if the rats haven't chewed through the wood, if death hasn't taken a day off, and it never does. So here I am, lantern lit, shovel sharp, and another long, quiet shift ahead. I don't carry much. No knight's sword, no merchant's ledger, no priest's book of prayers. Just 3 things. A shovel, a lantern, and the kind of silence that doesn't ask questions. The shovel is my pride. Not new, not polished, just faithful. The handle's worn smooth by years of calluses, and the edge is nicked from rocks, bones, and the occasional nail no one bothered to remove. I've rewrapped it in twine 5 times. It fits my hands better than most gloves. You learn to trust your shovel the way a soldier trusts his blade. Not because it saves you, but because without it, you're just standing in the dark with nowhere to dig. Then there's the lantern. Oil burning, crooked, and held together with iron wire and quiet prayers. It's not bright, just enough to keep me from walking face first into a tombstone or misjudging the depth of a freshly dug hole. Sometimes the wind blows it out, and for a moment, I see nothing but the backs of my own eyelids and the long shadow of the open grave. That's when I hum. Not a tune, really, just sound. Something to fill the air until the flame returns. And then, silence. Silence is a tool in this line of work. Not just the absence of noise, but the ability to stay silent. To keep your head down when someone's weeping too hard to speak. To nod when the priest forgets your name again. To dig deeper when the earth feels like stone and no one's watching but the crows. I've heard things in that silence. The crack of old wood, the sigh of settling dirt, the faint rattle of something that might have been wind or memory. One time, I swear, the fingers on a body moved. Just a twitch. Nerves, maybe. Or imagination. Either way, I didn't ask. I just kept digging. That's part of the job too, knowing when not to ask. You want to last a day in this profession? Learn to love quiet. Real quiet. The kind that wraps around you like a second skin. That whispers, don't look too close. That reminds you the only voices that matter tonight are the ones you can't hear. Because once you hear something that isn't supposed to speak, you never unhear it. Shovel, lantern, silence. That's the holy trinity down here. People think digging graves is mindless. Just hole after hole, dirt in, dirt out, like we're shoveling potatoes. But the ground tells stories. You just have to learn how to listen. Soft earth? Probably a child. The soil gives way like it doesn't want to hold anything heavy. You barely need to press. And when you do, it feels wrong, like interrupting something fragile. Hard clay with gravel? Nobility. Or at least someone rich enough to afford a decent box and a stone to mark it. They like to go deep, as if 6 feet under wasn't enough distance between them and the rest of us. Sandy soil mixed with trash? Poor folk. Buried fast. Buried shallow. Sometimes the grave's not even there first. You hit old nails, scraps of fabric, maybe a tooth. The dead stack up in places like that, quietly, anonymously. There's also the smell. You'd be surprised how many types of rot there are. Sweet and sickly, someone embalmed. Rich, or at least loved. Sharp and sour, disease. Plague pits whisper to your nose, long before your shovel hits bone. The worst is wet rot, bodies buried too soon after rain. The scent climbs up your throat and settles in your jaw, like guilt you didn't earn. Then there's the weight of the dirt itself. Heavy ground means sorrow. You feel it in your spine. You dig slower without meaning to. It clings to your boots, your breath. One time, I swear, it felt like the earth was holding on to the coffin, like it didn't want to let go. And you notice things, patterns. The rich go in oak, the poor in pine, the forgotten in nothing at all. Some wear jewelry, some still clutch a letter, others just stare up from the dark, waiting for the lid. I try not to look too long. Eyes have a way of staying open, even when nothing else does. So no, it's not just labor. It's a strange kind of archaeology. One where the relics still smell like yesterday. One where the layers don't go by century but by heartbreak. Digging a grave is like reading the last page of someone's story without knowing the beginning. All you get is the ending, and a pile of earth to cover it. And even that doesn't always stay put. If you think the dead are hard to work with, try the weather. It's the one colleague who never calls in sick, never takes a break, and never, ever makes your job easier. Summer? That's when the ground turns to dry brick, and every swing of the shovel feels like picking a fight with a cathedral floor. Sweat pours down your back before you've even finished marking the plot. The air hangs thick with heat, and something sweeter, not flowers, decay. The sun bakes everything, including the mistakes of the living. Coffins warp, stones crack. Flies gather like mourners who didn't get the memo to leave. Winter? Oh, you'll beg for summer back. The soil freezes solid. The shovel rings against it like it's laughing at you. Some days, you don't dig so much as chip away, bit by bit, hoping your fingers don't go with it. And when you finally crack through, the ground gives a reluctant sigh, like it's annoyed you've disturbed its nap. Then there's the rain. That's a special kind of curse. Rain turns the graveyard into a mud pit. You sink with every step. Digging becomes swimming. The hole fills faster than you can empty it. Once, I nearly lost a boot and almost followed it down. Had to be hauled out by the priest and the coffin bearers, all of us soaked, swearing, and sliding like pigs at a festival none of us wanted to attend. And fog? Fog doesn't make it harder to work. It just makes it harder to remember why you're still doing this. It swallows the world. Gravestones vanish. Trees drift like ghosts. The lantern flickers. and you suddenly feel very alone. Or worse, not alone. But the worst weather is wind. Wind finds its way into everything. Your coat, your ears, your bones. It whistles through the cracks in the stone and makes the mausoleums moan. Once, I swore I heard someone calling my name. Turned out it was the wind dragging a wreath across a nearby grave. Still, I packed up early that night. So yes, I work outdoors. Technically, under the sky. But I'd trade it all for a ceiling, a stove, and walls that don't groan in the dark. Because the thing about digging graves isn't just the dirt. It's doing it in weather that feels like the sky itself wants to bury you too. The dead are, generally speaking, excellent company. They don't complain. They don't interrupt. And they don't ask you why the grave isn't exactly 6 feet deep when the ground's half stone and the rain hasn't stopped in 4 days. They just stay where you put them. It's the living who test your patience. They show up late, loud, and dressed like the funeral is a fair. One man brought a turkey leg, ate it during the sermon. Another argued with the priest over the price of the coffin, while the widow sobbed next to him. And don't get me started on mourning etiquette. Some cry like it's theatre, big, dramatic wails. Others barely glance at the grave before asking where to leave the wine bottle. I once saw a man spill beer into the grave and then say he would have wanted a drink on the way down. Maybe, but not warm and flat. Then there are the superstitious types. They ask if I've ever heard scratching from below, if I sprinkle salt around the coffin, if I carry garlic, as if the undead are picky eaters. I tell them the truth. The only thing that ever came back up was a poorly nailed lid during a spring flood. And no, it wasn't hungry, just floating. Children run through the headstones like it's a playground. Dogs dig at fresh mounds. And someone, always someone, leans against a marker and knocks it sideways like they've just had one too many meads. Sometimes they ask questions. Do you ever get scared? Do you talk to them? What's the worst thing you've seen? I always smile, nod, and say, oh, I've seen worse. Just this morning, in fact, when someone parked their cart on top of the flower beds. Because here's the truth. The dead are peaceful. It's the living who break things. They shout, stumble, spill, argue, and step where they shouldn't. They ask for more space in a place built for rest. They bring noise to where there's meant to be silence. But eventually, they all leave. Back to their noisy lives. And I stay behind. To fix what they disturbed. To straighten stones. To quiet the ground again. The dead don't judge me. The dead don't rush me. They don't gossip, groan, or give advice. They just wait. Which, honestly, is more than I can say for the bishop. Up here, people care a lot about titles. Baron, merchant, beggar, thief. Who owns the land? Who owes the land? Who walks over whom? But down here, none of that matters. Under 6 feet of dirt, everyone is equally horizontal. I've buried them all. Knights in polished armour, bakers with flour still on their sleeves, children with wooden toys, thieves with pockets still sewn shut. Once, even a monk who smelled suspiciously like wine. At first glance, you'd think the rich would still stand out. And they do, mostly by what they're buried in, not as mahogany coffins, carved lids, velvet linings that no one will ever see again. And yet, give it time, just a few seasons of rain and worms, and it all softens, evens out. We all rot at the same pace. Some just do it in more expensive boxes. There was a duke once, big funeral, 10 horses, a choir that sang until their voices cracked. They lowered him down like he was going to sleep in a feather bed. 2 plots over, a woman with no name wrapped in sackcloth, lowered by 2 tired hands. A week later, I passed by both graves. One had roses, one had weeds. But the silence, same. Sometimes families pay extra for location, near the church wall, under a tree, away from undesirable company. But the roots don't care. The worms don't check invitations. And the wind, it whistles through all names alike. You want real equality? Don't look to kings and courts. Look to graveyards. Down here, everyone has the same view, the underside of the sky. Same soil, same stones, same fading names. No one boasts. No one begs. No one cuts the line. It's humbling, in a way, to know that no matter how high you rise, how loud you shout, how fine your cloak or cruel your taxes, this is the address that waits for you. And I just make sure the neighbours are spaced right. Not too close, not too far. A little dignity in the dirt. Because in the end, we all check in at the same inn. Some with brass handles, some with twine, all with silence. Graveyards are supposed to be silent at night. That's what people think. That once the mourners go home, once the priest locks the chapel door, the world goes still. But silence here is never empty. It's full of sounds no one wants to claim. The wind always comes first. It doesn't howl. It whispers, long, low breaths that move through cracked stone and brittle grass. It makes the tall markers hum, like broken flutes in a song no one remembers. Then come the rats. They scurry fast, always just out of sight. They nest under old tombs, dart between weeds, and sometimes pause to stare, longer than is comfortable. I've named a few, not out of fondness, but familiarity. At least they're consistent, more so than most bishops. But it's the other sounds that stay with you. A rustle with no wind, footsteps where there's no path, a soft knock, tap, tap, from inside a sealed box. You tell yourself it's tree branches, or loose earth settling, or the echo of your own breath bouncing off stone. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes, well, there's a corner of the yard, far west, behind the old wall, where even the moon avoids looking too closely. The stones lean there, names long vanished, and when I pass by, the air shifts. Not colder, exactly, just heavier, like it's listening. One night, I dropped my lantern, bent down to relight it, and I swear, I heard a voice. Not a scream, just a word, my name, whispered like a secret someone buried, but didn't forget. I didn't answer, didn't look back, just kept walking, whistling a tune I didn't know I knew. Because that's how you make it through the night out here. You keep moving. You don't ask. You never, ever dig when no one told you to. And when the symphony plays, wind, rat, rustle, rattle, you listen politely, like an audience that doesn't want an encore. Because in a graveyard, sound is memory. And not all memories stay buried. So I walk softly, lantern swinging, boots careful, and when something behind me creaks, I assume it was the wind. Even when it wasn't, you'd think grave digging is safe work. No charging horses, no swinging swords, no fiery furnaces or collapsing scaffolds. Just dirt, just quiet, just holes. But let me tell you something. The dead aren't the dangerous part. It's everything around them that tries to kill you. Start with the ground itself. It shifts, collapses, especially after rain. 1 minute, you're standing firm. The next, your foot's sunk to the knee, and your shovel's dancing off somewhere like it's decided to retire without notice. I once slipped headfirst into a half-dug grave, landed on a coffin lid. Empty, thankfully. But the thud it made, I still hear it when it rains. Then there's the coffins. You'd be surprised how often they splinter. Weak wood, rotten corners, nails that come loose at just the wrong moment. I've had lids snap while lowering. Once the rope broke entirely. The whole box rolled and bounced like some grim game of dice. The priest screamed. The family screamed. I just apologized and started again. Dogs. Let's talk about dogs. Not the nice kind. I mean the strays that prowl the edges of town and think a graveyard is a buffet. I've chased more than one away from a fresh mound. One time, I found a bone missing. I didn't ask which part it was. I just buried deeper the next time. Tools fail too. Shovels snap. Lanterns die. And when you're knee-deep in a grave at midnight, surrounded by fog, and your only light vanishes, well, that does something to your breathing. No one talks about the injuries. The back pain from years of lifting wet earth. The cracked fingers in winter. The infected cuts from rusty nails or jagged stone. I've buried friends. Not from war or plague. From this, one slip, one loose edge, one night digging alone, and you go from worker to occupant. There's no insurance, no compensation, just a fresh hole beside the one you were digging, and maybe someone else muttering, "Poor bastard," as they toss your name in the church log. So no, it's not glamorous. It's not heroic. It's just dangerous in ways people don't see. Because when you dig for a living, the earth doesn't always give you warning. Sometimes it takes you too. That's why I always mark the next empty plot. Not for a stranger. For me, just in case the job decides I've overstayed. This isn't a job you take for the money. I don't get paid by the hour. I get paid by the hole. Sometimes 2 copper coins. Sometimes 3, if the family's feeling generous or guilty. I once got a loaf of bread as a tip. Stale but still. A bonus is a bonus. No one bribes a gravedigger. No one tips big to get a better hole. You get what the ground gives you. What I give you is a clean rectangle, deep enough to stay shut, and quiet enough to keep the neighbours from noticing when it settles. And yet, business is good. Because if there's one thing you can count on, it's death. Plagues come and go. Wars flare up like bad tempers, and then vanish into treaties no one reads. But people? People always die. Cold in the lungs, mud in the blood, or just plain bad luck on a slippery street corner. It keeps me busy. There are no holidays in this line of work. No feast days off. No Sabbaths. People die on saints' days too, even during royal weddings, even during snowstorms. Especially during snowstorms, honestly. Cold has a way of reminding the old. They're old. I keep a mental calendar, not by seasons, but by the pace of the dying. Summer's slower. People sweat it out. Fall picks up. Harvest accidents. Spoiled meat. And fights over rent. Winter's a festival of frostbite and fevers. Spring? That's when coughs turn to funerals. I've never been unemployed. I've had quiet days, sure, but they're followed by weeks that don't let you sleep. Back-to-back burials. Graves overlapping like patchwork. I've dug by moonlight. By torchlight. Once, by lightning, though that wasn't my best idea. But here's the thing. The job's steady. The clients don't complain. And the market never crashes. No one underbids me. No one opens a flashy new graveyard startup. There's no competition. Just dirt and time and me. I'm not rich. I'll never be. But I go to bed knowing tomorrow will bring another name, another hole, another hour in the cold. It's not much, but it's more reliable than most things in this world. Because kingdoms fall. Banks fail. Markets shift. But the dead? They always show up. Lunch break, if you can call it that. There's no bell that rings, no whistle, just a knot in your stomach that finally gets louder than the sound of the shovel hitting stone. That's when you pause, sit, maybe lean against a tombstone that doesn't mind being a chair for a few minutes. I eat where I work, always have. Sometimes it's on the edge of a fresh grave, sometimes it's on a slab no one's claimed yet. Once, I ate sitting on top of a crypt roof, legs dangling like a gargoyle with crumbs on its lap. No one joined me. That's the perk of my cafeteria. Guaranteed solitude. The menu? Depends on the day. A crust of bread, if it didn't mold overnight. A boiled egg, if I could afford one. Cheese, if the rats didn't find it first. I once had stew, real stew, with meat and vegetables and salt. It was my birthday. That was 3 years ago. No utensils, just hands. No tablecloth, just stone. No music, unless you count the wind, sighing through grass, and the occasional raven with opinions. It's so quiet, you hear everything. The creak of your joints, the crunch of dirt underfoot, even the sound of dust settling. It's not poetic, it's just that still. Sometimes, I forget I'm chewing. My jaw just moves on its own. My mind drifts, to the graves I've dug, to the ones I haven't yet, to names I can't remember but faces I oddly do. You'd think it'd be depressing, eating surrounded by the dead. But honestly, it's peaceful. No one argues. No one asks for a bite. No one tells you to hurry up or sit straighter or look more grateful for the job. It's just me, my lunch, and the quiet. Sometimes I talk out loud. Not much, just a few words. A greeting, a thought, maybe a joke. I like to think the ground listens, maybe even laughs, though I've never heard it. And when I'm done, I brush the crumbs off my coat. Pack away what's left, if there's anything left. And stand. Back to the shovel. Back to the earth. Back to work. Because in this job, the only break you really get is the one someone else is buried under. You learn not to look too closely. But sometimes you do. Not out of curiosity. Out of habit. Out of caution. Out of that quiet human itch called wonder. I've seen things buried with people. Things that speak louder than any mourner ever could. A girl once, no older than 10, clutching a broken doll. One arm gone, eyes scratched, dress sewn from scraps. She held it tight, like it mattered more than the prayers mumbled above her. A man with a rusted key on a string around his neck. No lock in sight. No one knew what it opened. Maybe he didn't either. Maybe it was just a reminder that once something had been his. Letters too, folded, sealed, unread. I never opened them, not because of respect, but because I think they weren't meant for the living. And if someone went to their grave, still holding words, maybe that silence is the ending they chose. One woman had a dried flower tucked behind her ear, faded, crumbling. A violet, I think. It must have meant something. It must have meant everything, because that was all she had with her. There was a soldier once, buried with a pair of dice, worn smooth from use. The priest called it sin. I call it honesty. We all gamble something. And then there are the strange ones. A spoon carved from bone, a lock of someone else's hair, a half-finished embroidery that still smelled of lavender. One man had 3 rocks, all painted black. No explanation, no note, just stones in his pocket like talismans. These things, they don't scream. They whisper. They say, I mattered to someone. I was afraid. I had a story, but no one wrote it down. You start to wonder who placed the items there. A lover? A child? The person themselves? Sometimes, I think the grave holds more than the body. It holds the unanswered, the unfinished, the undone. I cover them carefully. I never tell anyone what I saw. Not because it's forbidden, but because it feels sacred. Even if it's just a button, a grave may be the end of breath. But these small things, they're the echoes. The last things held. The last things remembered. The last things no one got to explain. Most nights in the graveyard are dark. Not just no torch dark. I mean swallowed by shadow. Black on black. Shapes that barely move. Air that doesn't feel like it belongs to the living. But then, there are moonlit nights. Silver spills over the stones. The grass glows faintly. Even the fog seems unsure, drifting like a curtain that forgot its cue. It's beautiful, in a way that makes your skin tighten. The dead don't move on nights like that, but they feel closer, like they're watching, or remembering. I walk slower on moonlit nights. My lantern stays dim, not out of fear, but respect. The moon doesn't need competition. It touches every corner of the yard, the cracked statues, the crooked crosses, even the old willow that hums when the wind turns right. And in that light, things look different. Graves don't seem quite as final. Stones don't seem so heavy. I've seen shadows stretch like arms, reaching, not to grab, but to recall. One night, I swear I saw a boy's outline, sitting beside a grave he never got to visit in life, just sitting, like he was waiting for a bedtime story that never came. The moon has a way of pulling the past forward. You see it in the way the light hits a name you'd forgotten was carved there, or the way a locket glints from shallow soil, catching just enough reflection to remind you someone once loved someone else that much. It's not haunting, it's longing. The kind that doesn't knock or rattle chains. It just lingers, a sigh across marble, a pause in the breeze, a silence too full to be empty. Sometimes I stop working entirely. Just stand there, let the cold light soak into my coat, into my bones. I think about who's buried where, who they waited for, who never came, who still visits in dreams. And in those moments, I'm not alone. Not really. There's no choir, no howling, no ghost with glowing eyes. Just a field of quiet remembering, and a sky that refuses to forget. When the moon's that full, even the dead seem brighter. And sometimes I wonder, just for a second, if someone down there is remembering me too. You spend enough time among the dead, and the living start to feel like strangers. They talk too loud, move too fast, want too much. Meanwhile, the ones underground, they're quiet, predictable, steady. Sometimes I forget how to hold a conversation that doesn't involve whispering or waiting for silence to answer. I know more names on headstones than I do in town. I remember who's buried where, what day they came in, what the weather was like. I forget birthdays. I forget market days. But I never forget which grave sinks faster after a storm. Neighbors wave at me in the street, then pretend they didn't. Children cross to the other side when I pass. Even the tavern barkeep gives me a smaller mug and sets it down like I might curse the countertop. I don't blame them. I smell like dirt. I carry ghosts. Not the haunting kind, the kind that clings like dust in your lungs. Funerals are the closest I get to company. Crowds gather, faces cry, voices crack over hymns and half-remembered prayers. And for a moment, I feel like I'm part of something, like I belong to the world above. But when they leave, I stay. I always stay. And it hits me again that I'm not really of the village anymore. I'm part of the in-between, the waiting room before whatever comes next. I don't dream much these days. When I do, it's mostly dirt, or stone, or someone I buried long ago, looking at me like they still have something to say. I wake up in my corner of the yard, wrapped in the same coat I dig with. Breakfast is cold, the tea is bitter, and no one knocks, because no one visits the gravedigger, unless they need something buried. Loneliness doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, like groundwater, like fog through cracks, like the silence after a final breath. And you start to wonder, not in fear, just in fact, if when your time comes, anyone will dig your grave. If anyone will remember the man who knew where everyone else was buried. Maybe not. But that's all right, because I've always belonged more to the quiet than the crowd. And the quiet? It remembers better than anyone, so now you know what it's like. To rise when others sleep, to eat where others grieve, to measure your days in shovels and your silence in miles. Being a gravedigger in the Middle Ages wasn't dramatic. It wasn't romantic. It was cold hands, crooked backs, and boots that never dried. It was knowing more names of the dead than the living. And it was doing your job so quietly, most forgot you existed until they needed you. There were no holidays, no applause, no songs sung in your name, just dirt and time, and the understanding that you were always one cough, one slip, one unlucky frost away from joining the very people you buried. But somehow, we endured. We learned to hear stories in the silence, to find dignity in the mud, to see beauty, not in marble, but in the way the moonlight touched a stone no one else noticed. So, would you have lasted a day? Honestly, probably not. But that's all right. You're here now, warm, breathing, far from the rats and the cold. All I ask is that next time you pass a grave, pause for a moment. Not for the dead, but for the one who dug that space. Someone with a shovel, and a name no one remembers. And if you're still awake, rest easy. Some of us are still down here, keeping the silence warm. Why you wouldn't last a day. Part 1, Lozan. Before the rifles, before the raids, before she became a whisper that even soldiers feared, there was the desert. A dry, endless horizon of wind and stone, where the air cracked like old leather, and the sun sat so heavy on your skin, it felt like the gods had pressed their thumbs into you. This was Apache land, not the one on maps, but the one known only by footsteps, starlight, and blood. And it was here, in the silent breath between mountain and sky, that Lozan was born. Not in a palace, not with a priest chanting prayers, but into dust, into wind, into survival. The elders said she arrived in the season of hard rains, when thunder rolled like drums across the peaks. Her name would come later, but even before that, the signs were there. The midwife claimed the wind stilled when Lozan first opened her eyes, as if the land itself was watching. A hawk circled low, a lizard froze mid-step. And the woman, wrapped in birth and silence, looked not like a baby, but a question, one the world wasn't quite ready to answer. You see, among the Apache, a child wasn't just born. She was read, interpreted, weighed between worlds. Some children came with laughter, others with shadow. Lozan came with stillness. They named her after the act of sneaking, of moving quietly through danger. But no one had to teach her. She was silence made flesh. As she grew, the tribe watched carefully. She didn't run like the other children. She moved like a shadow at dusk, slow, certain, already knowing where not to step. She listened more than she spoke. She prayed without being told. And when her brother, Victorio, first picked up a spear, Lozan picked up a stone and whispered to it, not in play, but like she was asking it a question. Old women in the village whispered that she had the sight, not the kind that sees with eyes, but with blood, with wind, with the pull of stars. Some said she was blessed by Usan, the creator. Others thought she was just strange, too quiet, too focused, too still. But then came the first sign. She was only a girl, maybe 9, when she stood at the edge of a campfire and said, quietly, "The soldiers will come from the west." No one believed her, not until they came. 5 days later, in dust and thunder, just as she said, from the west. After that, the elders paid attention. They brought her to the medicine man. He watched her, prayed with her, said nothing for 3 days. Then finally, she hears the ones who walk without sound. The name spread, the one who hears the invisible. But she didn't seek attention. She didn't boast. She just kept watching, listening. She spoke to horses with her hands, to wind with her eyes, and to fear with silence. The desert, you see, doesn't reward noise. It teaches patience. Lozan was desert-born in every way, sharp as cactus, quiet as dusk, and just as unforgiving. While other girls learned to cook, she learned to track. While others embroidered, she mapped the stars. She didn't want to be a wife. She wanted to understand why the hawk flew before the snake struck, why the fire cracked when someone lied, why the dreams came heavy after rain. And so, they let her be. Because even warriors know, there are some you don't try to shape, you just stand back and watch. By the time she was a teenager, even her brother, the war chief, consulted her. Not always out loud, sometimes just a glance. Lozan had become the kind of presence you felt before you saw. And if you think you'd last a day in that world, under that sun, on that land, with eyes like hers watching from behind a rock, you wouldn't. Not because she'd strike first, but because she already knew where you'd step, when you'd blink, and what you feared most. The desert doesn't give away its secrets. But Lozan listened anyway. She was still just a girl when the stories began. Stories whispered between saddle straps and nighttime fires. Not legends yet, just murmurs. A child who saw things she shouldn't have. Or maybe things no one else could. She never made a show of it. There were no trances, no dramatic declarations, just a quiet voice, steady as dusk, saying things that had no right to be true. "The riders won't take the river path," she once said. "They'll come from the ridge." The men looked at each other. There was no reason to believe her. The ridge was dry, steep, and exposed. No sane soldier would try it. They came from the ridge. Every time. It wasn't just once, or twice. It became a pattern, a rhythm. Lozan would go still, almost like sleep, then lift her chin slightly, close her eyes, and know. Where the enemy moved, how many, how far, where the danger lay like a coiled snake under brush. Some said it was magic, others said it was madness. Her brother, Victorio, said nothing. He just started listening. When the warriors gathered, Lozan would stand nearby, hands folded, silent, and when no one could decide, she would speak. Always simple, always soft, but always right. And so, the warriors began to wait for her words. Not because they believed in miracles, but because the girl had never been wrong. At night, she would sit beside the fire and stare into the embers, not dreaming, not praying, just watching. When someone asked what she saw, she'd shrug. "Footsteps," she once said. "Not ours." The next morning, scouts returned. Soldiers, 2 valleys away, marching. She couldn't explain how she knew. She didn't try. If asked, She'd tilt her head and say, "The wind tells stories." The older women called her a spirit child, half of earth, half of sky. Some men said she must have made pacts with ghosts. But Lozan didn't need ghosts. She had instinct, attention, and something more, something no one could name. It wasn't just knowing where. She knew when. When to move, when to wait, when to strike, and most importantly, when not to. On one occasion, the camp was ready to flee. Word had come of cavalry near the next valley. They packed up fast, horses tense, children hurried into blankets. But Lozan stood still. She looked west, closed her eyes, then shook her head. Not yet. They hesitated. Minutes passed, then hours. The soldiers never came. The scouts had been wrong. They would have run, exposed themselves for nothing. From then on, she wasn't just trusted. She was feared. They say she could ride alongside her brother and feel the movements of distant men like vibrations in the bones of the earth. Before the warriors set out, she would kneel, press her palm to the dirt. Sometimes she'd whisper, other times she'd just breathe. When she rose, she would point, and the path would be clear. If you think you would have dismissed her, this quiet girl with fire in her eyes, you wouldn't have survived long, because while you were looking for maps, she already felt the ambush. While you were questioning her logic, she was calculating your death. And if you think you would have sensed her before she sensed you, you wouldn't have, because she was there before the wind changed, before the birds went silent, before your shadow remembered fear. Some say she was touched by the gods. Others say she was one. But Lozan never claimed any of that. She didn't care for myths. She didn't crave titles. She had no crown, no cloak, no staff of bones or feathers. Only eyes that never blinked when danger came. Only hands that knew the direction before feet did. Only a heart that beat in rhythm with war. One warrior once asked her, "How do you know?" Lozan didn't answer at first. She just looked at him. Then, quietly, "When you carry the lives of others in your chest, their dangers whisper louder." That was the truth of her gift. It wasn't magic. It was responsibility. She wasn't just predicting. She was protecting. Not just seeing, but feeling. The tremble of mothers hiding. The breath of warriors not ready to die. The fear of children trying not to cry. She held it all. And in that burden came clarity. The kind of clarity that makes gods jealous. The kind of clarity that would make you crumble before the day's sun even reached its highest point. She never called it a gift. There were no fancy words, no dramatic rituals, just moments. Moments where Lozan would pause in the middle of silence, tilt her head, and say, "Not this trail." Moments where warriors stopped their horses mid-step because she had gone still, and when she went still, the desert held its breath. Some swore she read minds. Others said she read the earth. Either way, people listened, because Lozan had a habit of being right. Soldiers feared her not for her strength, but for her accuracy, the way she seemed to know what they were thinking, even before they knew it themselves. They'd set traps, ambushes down ravines or behind low brush, places that looked innocent, logical. Lozan would glance once, and turn the entire party around. No questions, no maps, just a quiet certainty. And hours later, someone would return to the old path and find boot prints, bullet casings, sometimes blood. But was it magic? Or something else? She never said. She never needed to. But those who rode with her noticed things. She always watched the birds, not just their flight, but their silence. She knew when they vanished too suddenly, when the ground felt wrong underfoot, even if the sky was calm. She could hear the rhythm of wind and know it was broken. She once told a young scout, "When the ants move at night, they're not alone." He laughed. Until they found cavalry tracks 2 miles east. Lozan didn't explain her instincts. She used them. To you, her silences might have seemed strange, her sudden choices irrational. But to her, the land was a conversation. The wind spoke in pauses, the dirt held secrets. And she listened better than anyone alive. Victoria once said, "Lozan has the power of far sight. She can sense the enemy's motion, even when they are far off. She finds their direction and warns us." He was her brother, but he was also her commander, and even he deferred to her when it mattered most. In modern terms, you might call her a tactical genius, a mind that could hold maps no one had drawn, calculate odds no one had spoken, and sense danger that hadn't yet arrived. But if you had told her that, she would have smiled, maybe, then gone quiet again. Because for Lozan, survival wasn't about theory. It was feeling. It was the ache in your bones before a storm, the breath that catches even when no one is behind you. They say generals plan on paper. Lozan planned in silence. She didn't need 5 steps ahead. She only needed one. The right one. During one escape, with soldiers closing in on all sides, the group panicked. They had 3 trails ahead. All looked the same. One led to a canyon, one to an open plain, one to the dark forest. Lozan looked at each. She pointed to the canyon. Someone protested. "It's a dead end." She said nothing. They followed her anyway. Hours later, they discovered the forest had been filled with soldiers. The plain was scouted from above. The canyon had a hidden path, masked by rockfall. Only she had seen it. Or felt it. If you had been there, you might have argued, demanded evidence, demanded logic. But that's why you wouldn't have lasted. Because Lozan didn't argue. She acted. And in war, hesitation is death. Her strength wasn't brute force. It was the kind that cannot be taught. The kind that sees beyond the now. That knows when a heartbeat shifts, when a silence is too loud, when the desert tries to warn you and you fail to hear. They called her a tracker, a prophet, a mind reader. But Lozan needed no titles. She just needed to keep her people alive. And she did, again and again, by trusting something deeper than maps or orders. She trusted what she felt, and what she felt was almost always right. So, was she reading minds? Or simply reading the world better than anyone else? It didn't matter, because if you ever found yourself standing across from her, dust in your mouth, sweat in your eyes, you'd feel it. That chill, that pause, that moment where she looked through you and knew exactly what you were about to do. Before even you did, every warrior had a title. Some earned theirs in blood, others inherited them. Victorio, Lozan's older brother, was a chief, respected, strategic, fierce. But when the desert whispered, even Victorio looked to his sister. Lozan never wore a feathered headdress. She had no carved staff, no ceremonial beads that shimmered in the firelight. She wore dust. She wore silence. She wore the weight of knowing. To outsiders, she was just the chief's sister, another Apache woman, perhaps a bit more quiet, a bit more strange. But among her people, she was the one who didn't need maps. She felt the land the way others feel pain, instinctive, immediate. When Victorio gathered the warriors, all eyes turned to him. But when they didn't know which path to take, all eyes turned to her. Not because she demanded it, but because they had learned, slowly, and then all at once, that Lozan saw what they didn't. She never gave speeches, never barked commands. Her guidance came as a hand raised gently in the wind, a slight shake of the head, a single word, wait. And they waited. Because when Lozan said wait, it wasn't caution. It was certainty. Victorio led with strength. Lozan led with silence. He was the flame. She was the smoke that revealed what the flame couldn't reach. In one campaign, their band was surrounded, soldiers closing from every side. Maps offered no hope. Logic pointed towards surrender. But Lozan walked the ridge, stood still, listened. Then she pointed, not to a trail but to a crack in the rock, a place too narrow for horses, too jagged for the eye to trust. Victorio didn't question her. They followed. Behind that crack was a hidden pass. The soldiers never found them. It wasn't luck. It was Lozan. Her brother carried the title. She carried the weight. Because leadership, in their world, wasn't always about being out front. Sometimes, it was about being the only one who knew where the ground would fall out from under you. Some of the younger men resented her, whispered that it wasn't natural for a woman to guide warriors. She heard them. She just didn't respond. She didn't need their permission to see what she saw. And when her warnings saved them, Again and again they stopped whispering. Lozan wasn't loud, but the earth spoke loud enough through her. On quiet nights, when Victorio sat by the fire planning raids or defences, Lozan often sat beside him, sharpening her knife in long, slow strokes. She rarely interrupted, but when she did, he listened. Not because she was his sister, but because he'd learned, early on, that she was usually 10 steps ahead. People say leadership is about voice, but Lozan led with presence. She could stand at the edge of a camp, arms folded, and change the energy of the entire group, without a word. Because she wasn't guessing. She knew where danger was. She felt where fear would strike. There was a time when they lost their way in a dust storm. The sky swallowed itself. Visibility dropped to inches. People screamed. Horses panicked. Lozan said nothing. She dismounted, put her hand to the ground, waited. Then she stood, pointed, and began walking. They followed. Hours later, they reached shelter, bone-tired, wind-scraped, but alive. They asked her later how she knew. She said, "The wind always leaves something behind." That's all. You see, in a world of force, Lozan was function. In a culture of sound, she was signal. You would have missed it. You would have followed the loudest voice, the biggest weapon, the clearest trail, and you would have walked right into an ambush, because you didn't see the one who saw everything. Victorio had vision, but Lozan had sight. If you'd been there, you might have tried to lead, tried to speak louder, move faster, and you would have failed, because Lozan wasn't just the sister of the chief. She was the one who made survival possible. To follow her didn't feel like obedience. It felt like instinct, like letting gravity guide your feet downhill, like breathing before you remember that you need to. She didn't need a title. She had the wind, and the wind trusted her. You've heard the stories of warriors who roared into battle, faces painted, voices raised like thunder, men who charged like stampedes and struck like lightning. Lozan wasn't one of them. She didn't need to scream. Her silence said enough. Her enemies feared her, not because she was loud, but because she wasn't. She didn't shout commands. She didn't chant or taunt. She moved, clean, quiet, absolute, like a shadow that didn't wait for the sun to set. In her hands, a revolver was not just metal and powder. It was punctuation. A sentence ended. A question silenced. She carried a Colt .45, well-worn, well-used, but cared for like a sacred tool. She didn't show it off. She didn't name it. But it never missed when it mattered. Strapped at her side was a knife. Simple, sharp, silent. It was never about the weapon. It was about when to use it. She fought beside men who screamed into battle, blood rushing, hearts pounding loud enough to deafen reason. But Lozan? She was already there. Before the scream, before the shot. She moved like wind behind rocks. She struck like a whisper you don't hear until it's already behind you. Once, during a night raid, a young warrior froze. His gun jammed. His breathing was too loud. The enemy was close. Lozan didn't panic. She took one step forward. 2 shots. 1 breath. The enemy fell. And she kept walking. No words. No glory. Just the next step. She had no armor. The land was her shield. She wore the dust of mountains and the scent of gunpowder. Her hair braided back. Her eyes steady. Her boots worn from miles and miles of survival. Some called her a ghost. Some said she could vanish behind trees no wider than a man's arm. Others whispered that even when you didn't see her, you felt her. That was worse, because noise can be tracked. But fear, the kind that grows from not knowing where she is, that lingers. You might think war is about clashing steel and wild chaos. But in Lozan's world, war was rhythm. Breathe, wait, move, strike, vanish. In one legendary battle, her group was pinned near a canyon wall. Soldiers surrounded them from the cliffs above. Panic spread like fire. Ammunition was low. The escape routes were traps. Lozan crouched, hand resting on stone, eyes scanning without panic. Then, without raising her voice, she pointed to a ridge no one had noticed, a narrow, dangerous path. She led them across, last in line, watching over every back. They escaped. The soldiers never saw how, because they were watching for noise, and Lozan didn't make any. Her silence was not absence. It was concentration, like a blade unsheathed slowly. You knew it was coming, but you still couldn't stop it. In combat, she never rushed. She waited for the moment that felt right. Not by the clock, not by instruction, by something older, something you can't explain unless you've lived with the wind in your lungs and the dirt beneath your nails. They say her eyes were her deadliest weapon, not because they were fierce, but because they saw everything. She once shot a soldier through thick brush without line of sight. Lucky guess, someone said. Lozan didn't reply, because when you feel the air shift, and the bird lifts too soon, and your skin tightens at the wrong moment, it's not guessing, it's listening. She didn't need intimidation. She didn't need a war cry. The enemy feared her because she didn't play their game. While they were trying to be loud, she was already behind them. One captured scout said, "I never heard her coming. I just felt, watched." Then the ground shifted, and there she was, like the silence had grown teeth. Lozan didn't celebrate kills. She didn't tally victories. She carried each one like a stone in her pocket, adding weight, not glory. Because every battle was survival. And survival wasn't a story. It was work. It was blood. And choices. And silence. If you had ridden with her, you might have tried to keep pace. You might have charged ahead, fired too soon, shouted warnings. She wouldn't have stopped you. But when your noise brought the enemy too fast, and the dust began to rise, and the bullets started to fly, you'd look to her, and she'd already be moving. Not to protect you, not to correct you, but to end it. You wouldn't have lasted beside her, not because she was cruel, but because she knew the rhythm of war, and you never learned the beat. In the end, it wasn't her gun or her knife that gave her power. It was the stillness, the terrifying calm, the way she moved without needing to announce it. Because anyone can shoot, anyone can scream, but to strike like wind and vanish like dusk, that takes more than muscle. That takes Lozan. They called it a man's world. The battlefield, the rifle, the blood, the burden. Men led, men fought, men died. And yet, there she was, Lozan, moving through the war camp with eyes that made even seasoned warriors lower their voices, not because she demanded respect, but because they didn't know what else to offer her. She didn't fit. She wasn't supposed to. Apache women were meant to gather, to cook, to bear children, to pray. But Lozan was not meant. She was made. By wind, by instinct, by necessity. She rode like she was born in the saddle, slept with her boots on, kept her weapons within reach even in the rare hours she let her guard drop. She didn't wear feathers. She wore dust. She didn't braid flowers. She wrapped her knife handle in deer hide, rough and blood-soaked. Other women whispered blessings over their children. Lozan whispered to the wind before a raid. No one taught her how to fight. She just learned. Like fire learns to burn, like rivers learn to carve rock. The men around her noticed, first with confusion, then with discomfort, and finally with awe. She didn't challenge them. She didn't need to. She just kept surviving. And survival, over time, becomes its own kind of power. Victorio never treated her like just a sister. He treated her like a compass. Because when your enemies outnumber you, outgun you, and chase you across the bones of your ancestors, you don't care if guidance comes from a man, a woman, or the wind itself. You just follow. And Lozan never led wrong. There were times when younger warriors would question her presence. She shouldn't be here, they'd mutter. She should be home, with the women. And then the ambush would come. And then she'd save their lives. And the camp would go quiet again. She didn't belong in the roles they wrote for her. She was too sharp for the kitchen, too still for the circle of gossip, too wide-eyed for the safety of small lives. She was not made for the firing. She was made for the mountain's edge, where decisions meant death or survival. One soldier wrote in his journal, "There is a woman among the Apaches who rides like thunder and kills without joy. They say she is sister to the chief, but I think she is the chief beneath the skin. Lozan didn't need recognition. She wasn't chasing applause. She chased safety, for her people. She chased silence, so others could sleep. She chased prophecy, because it had chased her since birth. She didn't speak often, but when she did, men listened. And not because they feared her, because they trusted her, because she saw what they didn't, felt what they missed, moved when they froze. If you think you would have stood beside her, matched her stride, shared her silence, carried her weight, you wouldn't have. Not because you lacked strength, but because you lacked solitude. And Lozan lived in solitude, even when surrounded, even when followed. She didn't need brotherhood. She had the earth. She had the dust under her boots, the sky above her eyes, and the wind that knew her name before any man did. They called her a warrior, yes, but never in jest. The kind of warrior who prays before she draws, who rides last so she can watch your back, who doesn't drink to victories, because every death is a weight. She didn't wear medals. She wore scars, not just on her body, but on her quiet. That pause between her breath and her next command, that was history. That was pain. That was cost. In a world of men yelling orders, Lozan was the pause between heartbeats, the space between danger and action, the breath before the gun fires. She wasn't accepted because she demanded to be. She was accepted because the war made space for her, because in the smoke and fear, she was steady. She was needed. And slowly, even the most prideful warriors learned. When Lozan speaks, you listen. When Lozan leads, you follow. When Lozan draws her weapon, you thank her for the silence that follows. You wouldn't have lasted a day in her boots. Not because you couldn't carry the gun, but because you couldn't carry the quiet. Because being a woman among warriors wasn't just about fighting. It was about being doubted every second. And still being right. Again, and again, and again, they thought warriors only carried weapons. Steel, powder, blood. But Lozan carried something else. She carried silence. She carried prayer. And before every battle, she knelt. Not in fear, not in weakness, not to beg, but to listen, because Lozan never believed she fought alone. The others would sharpen knives, count bullets, tighten straps. She would walk just beyond the camp, where the dirt was undisturbed, where the wind still moved like breath, and kneel. No drumbeat, no chant, just her hand, resting lightly on the ground. Just her lips, moving with words not meant to be heard. To an outsider, it might have looked like superstition. To Lozan, it was guidance. She didn't ask the spirits to save her. She asked them to speak. And they did. In wind that shifted. In fire that crackled a certain way. In a crow that flew off course. She paid attention. Because war, to Lozan, was never just steel and blood. It was the old world, waking. They say her prayers weren't long. Just a few quiet lines, repeated softly, offered not to gods with crowns, but to the mountain that raised her, the soil that fed her, the silence that shaped her. Her ancestors were not dead. They were wind, and wind knows how to whisper. Before one battle, when spirits were heavy and warriors doubted, Lozan stood. She lifted her face to the sky, and she said only this: "Let the bullet miss if it must. Let the knife fail if it will. But let the path be clear, and let me not lose the way." Then she turned, and led them into darkness. They returned by sunrise. All of them. Victoria once said, "She prays not for herself, but for the people." He wasn't exaggerating. Lozan never prayed for victory. She prayed for wisdom, for clarity, for enough strength to keep walking, even when walking meant carrying grief. Her prayers were not just words. They were offerings. She gave up fear. She gave up pride. She gave up the comfort of doubt. And in return she received stillness. And in that stillness, clarity. During a winter retreat, cold biting through skin and morale, a young boy cried at night. Lozan wrapped her blanket around him. Then she stepped outside, alone, into the snow. She faced the mountain, eyes closed, and whispered something into the frozen wind. The boy stopped crying. No one heard what she said. But the next morning, the storm broke. If you had watched her, you might have called it strange. A woman kneeling in dust before war. A warrior with her hand on the ground and her eyes closed when enemies were approaching. You would have thought it wasted time. And that's why you wouldn't have lasted. Because Lozan wasn't wasting time. She was aligning herself with the earth, with the ancestors, with the rhythm of something deeper than panic. Her faith wasn't in symbols. It was in sensation. The tremble in her feet when something was wrong. The pressure in her chest before danger. The taste of metal on her tongue before a fight. These were her signs. Her prayers were not to command the world. They were to understand it. She prayed like someone who knew she wasn't alone. Not just among warriors, but among ghosts. Among echoes. Every rock she passed had heard stories before her. Every gust of wind had carried cries she had never made. She was not the first to kneel, but she made sure not to be the last. To those who rode beside her, Lozan's prayers were a kind of armor. They trusted her words more than shields. Not because they understood them, but because they worked. After one ambush, when a young scout asked her how she knew to avoid the ridge, she answered simply, "I asked the mountain." He laughed, nervously. She didn't. You wouldn't have lasted beside her. Not because you lacked strength, but because you lacked stillness. Because where others shouted, she whispered. Where others rushed, she waited. Where others feared dying, she feared forgetting who she was. Lozan didn't fight to win. She fought to protect. She didn't pray to be spared. She prayed to stay worthy of the fight. In every battle, she carried bullets, but also ashes, feathers, and a single stone from her childhood canyon. Because Lozan never forgot what held her, and what watched her, and what would remember her when she became dust again. You may think warriors don't kneel, but Lozan knelt, and every time she did, something in the world bent gently with her, as if even the earth itself knew. This is the one who listens, and this is the one we guide. You can measure a person's power by what their enemies whisper when they think no one's listening. And when soldiers spoke of Lozan, they rarely raised their voices. They spoke low, as if louder words might summon her, as if her name was more echo than breath. Among the Apache, she was honored. Among outsiders, she was something else. A shadow, a myth, a chill on the back of your neck when the desert grew too quiet. They said she could disappear between two stones. Said her footsteps left no mark in the sand. Said she could smell fear like smoke. None of it was proven. All of it was believed. To her people, Lozan was not above them. She was among them. She shared their hunger, their miles, their prayers. But she also saw further, felt deeper, moved sooner. That's what made her different. Not some divine gift, but attention. Absolute, unwavering, brutal attention. After battles, warriors would describe how Lozan always seemed to appear where she was most needed. Not with flash, with timing, a second before the bullet, a heartbeat before the ambush. She was rarely early, never late. They didn't call her fearless. They called her necessary, because even the bravest warrior pauses when the night grows too silent. And in that pause, they looked for her. If she stood still, they waited. If she nodded, they moved. Her presence became a compass, not based on rank, based on trust. To the enemy, that made her dangerous. Because you can fight men. You can read their tactics, predict their steps. But how do you fight someone who already knows where you'll be? How do you prepare for silence? One cavalry officer wrote in his report, "There is a woman who rides with Victorio. The men call her the listening one. She has the eyes of someone who has already seen the ending. She is more dangerous than any rifle." That was from a man who never saw her face, only her effect. They feared her not because she killed without mercy, but because she killed without drama. No joy, no revenge, no hesitation, only purpose. And that is the kind of enemy who keeps you awake at night. Lozan never sought attention, but attention found her. It followed in the way soldiers told stories with nervous hands, in the way survivors claimed she had ridden past them in the fog, only to vanish. in the way men sharpened their blades too fast when her name was mentioned, trying to quiet their fear with steel. Even her allies didn't always understand her. She wasn't loud around the fire, didn't laugh often, rarely joined the celebrations. But when she did, it was quiet, just enough to remind them she was human, not myth. Still, they knew better than to lean too close. There was a line around Lozan, not drawn by arrogance, drawn by something older, like she carried too much spirit to be fully touched. Children admired her from a distance, not because she smiled at them, she rarely did, but because their parents did, and children always know who the adults follow without question. Once, after a skirmish, a wounded Apache fighter was carried to safety. He was delirious, feverish, but he whispered only one thing. "Is she here?" They didn't ask who. They didn't have to. They just nodded. And he slept. That's what she became. Not just a warrior, not just a scout, but a presence, a feeling of safety wrapped in silence, a warning wrapped in wind. Even in death, she was spoken of carefully. Years later, soldiers who had never faced her firsthand still mentioned her in training stories. "Watch the wind," they'd say. She might still be out there, not as superstition, as possibility, because Lozan didn't belong to history. She belonged to the land. And the land, as every warrior learns, doesn't forget. You wouldn't have lasted beside her, not because she hated you, but because she wouldn't have seen you. You would have been too loud, too proud, too hungry for praise. And Lozan didn't speak to those who needed applause. She spoke to the mountain, to the soil, to the fire that remembers. And it spoke back. They always ask about the battles, the guns, the blood, the kills. But no one ever asks what she fought for. Not land, not revenge, not even victory. Lozan didn't fight because she hated the enemy. She fought because she loved what the enemy threatened. She fought for the fire at night, small, flickering, cupped by stone, where elders whispered stories not written anywhere. She fought for the stream that trickled through her homeland, its water cold even in summer, its sound like a lullaby no soldier could ever replicate. She fought for the silence of morning before footsteps were made, for the wind that carried the smell of pinon smoke and warm cornmeal, for the rhythm of home. And most of all, she fought for the ones who couldn't. The mothers with children strapped to their backs, the boys too young to lift a weapon, the old ones with trembling hands, who still remembered which rock held spirits and which tree whispered rain. Once, they found a cave. It was nothing really, just stone, dry air, and shadow. But inside, a child, alone, wrapped in hide, eyes wide, body still. His mother had hidden him there before the raid began. She hadn't survived. But Lozan found him. And in that moment, war stopped being a strategy. It became a promise. From then on, every bullet she carried was for that child, and all the ones like him. Children who didn't know what war meant, only that the fire was gone, the river dry, and their mother no longer breathing. You see, Lozan didn't fight to win. She fought to keep stories alive, to keep songs sung, to keep ashes warm, to keep grief from multiplying. One night, before a long escape, a young girl, barely 5, reached up and touched Lozan's hand. No words, just trust. And Lozan carried her across a mile of darkness. She didn't write it in any journal. She never spoke of it. But her steps were slower that night, because she wasn't carrying a child. She was carrying the future. Hatred burns too fast. Lozan knew that. It blinds. It consumes. But love? Love is colder, sharper, harder to shake, because it roots you, anchors you to people, not pride. She didn't dream of crushing the enemy. She dreamed of quiet camps, of full pots, of children laughing before bedtime, of voices returning, again and again, to tell the same story, because the same story meant the world hadn't ended yet. She never told others what to believe, but when she fought, they felt it. Not rage, not glory, but protection. That's why people followed her, because she didn't promise triumph. She promised effort. endurance, continuance. A warrior once asked her, "What if they never stop coming?" Lozan answered without looking up, "Then we never stop protecting." She never bragged, but she remembered. Every name, every fire left behind, every stream dried by hoofprints, every song interrupted mid-verse, and she carried them like stones, not heavy enough to break her, but just heavy enough to keep her moving. You wouldn't have lasted beside her, not because you weren't brave, but because you might have asked the wrong question. You might have asked, "Who deserves to die?" But Lozan never asked that. She asked, "Who deserves to live?" And the answer was always the same. The mother with cracked lips, the boy without shoes, the old man who still remembered where the herbs grew, the girl who hadn't yet learned fear. That's why she fought. That's why she knelt before battle. Why she slept with one hand on her weapon and one near the child beside her. Not to destroy, but to preserve. She didn't carry flags. She carried blankets and water skins. And, once, a sick baby wrapped tight against her chest for 20 miles of running. No one wrote a song about that, but it was the most heroic thing she ever did. Lozan's victories were quiet. A meal unburned. A family unbroken. A girl who lived long enough to become a mother. Her war wasn't for power. It was for presence. For the right to be. To exist beside a fire again, without fearing the wind-carried boots behind it. So when you think of warriors, don't look only for scars. Look for hands that hold too carefully. Eyes that never stop scanning the horizon. And footsteps that never rush, but never stop. Because some warriors don't scream. They carry. Lozan carried until her legs gave out. And even then, she passed the weight gently to those behind her. Like a torch. Like a name. Like a story meant to be told. Not loudly, but often. History remembers generals, kings, flags and treaties. But sometimes, it remembers a whisper. Lozan was never crowned. She was never given command by vote or scroll. But when she spoke, warriors listened. And when she moved, the world seemed to follow. She wasn't famous because she killed the most. She was remembered because she protected the most. Because she never let fear take root where her feet had already passed. Because she never let grief stop her hands from holding a child. Because she never stopped listening to the wind, to the mountain, to the stories etched in silence. She didn't seek revenge. She sought return. Return to fires that didn't need hiding. To rivers that weren't poisoned by boots. To mornings where no one woke in panic. To homes that stayed. That's why she prayed. Why she bled. Why she carried more than just weapons. Lozan's strength wasn't in her trigger finger. It was in her stillness. Her waiting. Her knowing when to step sideways instead of forward. Her choosing not to fight sometimes, and knowing that not fighting was often the braver act. And yes, she was feared. But not because she cursed or screamed. Because she knew. Because she saw. Because she felt the shape of danger before it had even found a form. She was a map with no ink. A compass with no metal. A guide whose only tool was trust. You wouldn't have lasted beside her. Not because you weren't strong, but because you would have needed explanation. And Lozan offered none. Only direction. Only protection. Only quiet action. She died far from her homeland. A prisoner. Unarmed. Not surrounded by warriors, but by walls. And yet, even there, even in her final days, those around her said her presence still changed the air, still calmed the sick, still watched every movement with those same unwavering eyes. She didn't need to be buried in legend, because she had already become it. The kind passed down not with trumpet and book, but with whisper and wind. To this day, when the desert holds its breath, when the fire pops but the night remains still, when the hawk turns too early or the mountain goes quiet, some say Lozan is near, not to haunt, but to guide, because warriors die. But the ones who protected, they stay. In stories, in silence, in every child that sleeps because someone else stayed awake. Lozan, the warrior who didn't need a battlefield to be remembered. Just a fire, a path, and someone worth protecting. Imagine waking up in a world where there is no shampoo, No soap, no conditioner, no dry shampoo, leave-in mist, or peppermint scalp scrub. There is no hot shower humming behind a curtain of steam. No fluffy towel, no hairdryer, no detangling comb. You sit up from a bed stuffed with hay or wool, on sheets that haven't been washed in months. The air smells of smoke and livestock. You reach up and feel your hair. It's stiff. Not because of product, but because of weeks, maybe months, of sweat, soot, and kitchen grease slowly stiffening each strand. In the past, hair wasn't just dirty by today's standards. It was dirty by any standard. Across ancient civilizations and through medieval life, hygiene was not what it is today. Bathing, if it happened at all, was rare, more ritual than routine. Water had to be fetched, boiled, poured. Soap, if it existed, was harsh and limited, and hair was often the last thing to be prioritized. There was no such thing as shampoo. The word itself wouldn't be invented for centuries. People used what they had: water, vinegar, ash, clay, or in some cases, fermented mixtures of herbs, animal fat, or even stale urine. It wasn't about beauty, it was about survival, practicality, and doing the best you could with the tools of the time. Combs were made from bone, horn, or wood. They were carved by hand, and often had widely spaced teeth. People didn't comb their hair to style it, but to try and remove some of the grime, the dust, and the living creatures. Because make no mistake, hair, back then, wasn't just dirty. It was a home, a micro-ecosystem. Fleas, lice, and other small insects made their homes in unwashed strands. The scalp wasn't just dry or oily. It was often inflamed, itchy, and full of scabs or sores. People didn't necessarily complain, because to them, it was normal. It was life. The idea of clean hair, as we know it today, did not exist. No one had glossy, fresh-smelling, bounce-enhanced locks. No shampoo commercial swish. Hair was covered in dust from roads, soot from fires, grease from unwashed hands, and sometimes ash or animal fat from makeshift hair treatments. In fact, people didn't often wear their hair out at all. Women covered their heads with scarves, veils, or wimples. Men wore hats, hoods, or helmets. Hair was hidden, not just for modesty or status, but because it was a mess, unpredictable, unscented, and usually stuck together. And then there was the kitchen. For most people, life revolved around an open fire. There was no ventilation, no range hood. Every meal meant smoke in your face, and that smoke clung to your clothes, your skin, and especially your hair. Imagine the scent of old bacon and burning logs becoming part of your natural musk. In noble households, it was common to scent the hair with herbs or oils, not to clean it, but to cover its smell. Lavender, rosemary, or myrrh were used to mask what everyone already knew, that nobody's hair was clean, just less awful. Even royalty, surrounded by servants and luxury, did not escape this truth. Wigs became popular in some cultures not for beauty, but for necessity. It was easier to shave the head and wear a scented artificial hairpiece than to deal with the infestation and odor. In many cases, the goal wasn't to clean the hair, it was to manage the consequences of never cleaning it. So, the next time your conditioner doesn't foam the way you want it to, or you forget your dry shampoo before work, remember this: once upon a time, having bad hair didn't mean frizz or flatness. It meant lice, soot, grease, smoke, sweat, and no hope of fixing any of it until the next full moon. Hair wasn't an expression of identity. It wasn't fashion. It was something you learned to tolerate. And in a way, it's remarkable. Because despite the discomfort, the smell, the crawling, the knots, people lived. They laughed, they danced, they told stories around smoky fires with their tangled, dusty hair tucked beneath cloth and shadow. They survived, even without shampoo. In the Middle Ages, lice were not considered a problem. They were considered a part of life. You could be a farmer or a baker, a nobleman or a knight, a monk in a cold monastery or a child playing in a sunlit courtyard. It didn't matter. You had lice. They were not a punishment. They were not a sign of poverty. They were simply expected, like the rising sun or the sound of distant bells. They lived with you, on you, in you. These tiny insects crawled along the scalp, tucked into the folds of clothing, and laid their eggs in the warmest corners of the body, behind ears, under hats, in seams of collars and around waists. They fed on blood, and their bites caused endless itching. But again, this was normal. People didn't ask, "Do you have lice?" They asked, "How bad are they today?" Sometimes, people would gather in groups to help each other pick the lice out, carefully inspecting hair strand by strand. It was a social act, a bonding ritual, an exchange of care in a world full of discomfort. In many cultures, delousing was part of daily routine, like brushing teeth today. If you had the luxury of a friend or servant to help, the task became easier. If not, you scratched, constantly. Itching was universal. No one escaped it, even royalty. Kings had lice. Queens had lice. Their servants, who dressed their hair in oils and herbs to mask the scent, also had lice. The ornate headpieces and jewels worn in court ceremonies often covered scalps that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Beneath gold and velvet, there were bugs. And it wasn't just head lice. There were body lice, pubic lice, and even beard lice. Wherever there was warmth and skin and hair, lice made a home. They didn't just live with you, they traveled with you. When you shared a bed, you shared your bugs. When you borrowed a cloak or hat, you inherited a colony. Clothing, blankets, and even church pews became highways of transmission. You couldn't escape them by washing. There were no chemical shampoos, no sanitizing sprays. Boiling clothes or shaving the head entirely were the only true methods of control, and even those didn't last. The lice always came back. In monasteries, monks often shaved their heads, partly for religious devotion, partly because hair was simply too much work. A bald head meant fewer bugs. Not no bugs, just fewer. In some towns, barbers were licensed not just to cut hair, but to perform minor medical tasks. This included checking for lice or shaving heads during times of plague. Cleanliness and survival became tangled, and sometimes the best defense was a razor. The symbolism of lice is quietly woven through the art and writing of the era. Some illuminated manuscripts include small figures scratching their heads. Others depict saints resisting temptation, while quietly swatting at their own scalps. Lice were not poetic, they were just present, an everyday misery. And yet, people endured. Children learned to ignore the itching. Adults joked about it. Some people believed lice were actually a sign of good health, the proof the body was warm and alive. Better to have lice, they said, than to be cold and still. Superstitions also played a role. Some believed lice fed on sin, that scratching was a kind of penance. Others thought the bugs protected the body from worse diseases, like a strange, living shield. Of course, these ideas weren't based on science. But when you're living in a world without microscopes, antibiotics, or soap, belief is often the next best thing. So people kept scratching, kept sharing, kept shaving and delousing, and repeating the cycle. And the lice, ever persistent, ever patient, stayed. They were there in the beds of kings, in the helmets of knights, in the veils of nuns, in the curls of children and the beards of beggars. An empire of insects, hidden in plain sight. The true crown of the medieval head was not made of gold, but of tiny claws and eggs, tucked between the roots of unwashed hair. No one invited them, but no one was truly without them. In our world today, a shaved head might seem like a bold fashion choice, something sleek, minimal, maybe even edgy. But in the ancient and medieval world, a shaved head was something else entirely. It was cleanliness, it was status, and sometimes it was survival. Let's begin in ancient Egypt, where the desert sun was brutal and the Nile offered little relief from heat, sweat, and insects. Egyptian nobles didn't grow their hair long. In fact, many didn't grow their hair at all. They shaved their heads completely, not just for comfort, but for hygiene. In a world without shampoo, a bald scalp was a practical solution. No tangles, no lice, no sweat-matted curls catching desert dust. Smooth skin was easy to wash, easier to scent with oils, and harder for parasites to make a home. But bald didn't mean bare. Wealthy Egyptians wore wigs, elaborate ones, carefully braided, perfumed with myrrh and resin. sometimes adorned with beads, ribbons, or gold leaf. These wigs were not just accessories, they were symbols. They said, "I have servants, I have style, I am above all this dirt." And when the day was done, the wig came off. The scalp was wiped clean, and the head, bare and gleaming, could finally breathe. In other words, to be hairless was to be powerful. The same was true, in a different way, in ancient Rome. Barbershops or tonstronai were central to social life. Boys received their first haircut as a coming-of-age ritual. Soldiers often had their heads shaved before battle, not for discipline, but because lice didn't care about patriotism. In fact, some Roman elites kept their hair closely cropped or shaved altogether. Like the Egyptians, they wore wigs, some imported from conquered lands, a symbol of wealth and reach. Your wig might be made of Gallic blonde hair, sewn by slaves, perfumed by attendants. Hair became fashion. No hair became luxury. Meanwhile, across the sea, in parts of ancient China, things were different, but just as symbolic. For many Chinese dynasties, hair was seen as a gift from one's ancestors. Cutting it was a form of disrespect. Long hair, tied and wrapped, was a sign of obedience, harmony, and family honor. But then came the Qing dynasty, and with it, forced haircuts. Men were ordered to shave the front of their heads and wear the rest in a long braid. The queue. This wasn't fashion, it was political domination. Resistance meant execution. Suddenly, shaving your head wasn't about hygiene or elegance, it was about loyalty or fear. In medieval Europe, things became spiritual. Monks, especially those under strict religious orders, shaved the crowns of their heads into what was called a tonsure, a bald circle in the middle, ringed by hair like a heavenly halo turned inside out. This was not a style anyone chose for vanity. It was a mark of devotion, a sign that the man beneath the hood had renounced earthly vanity. In truth, though, many monks welcomed the shave. Fewer lice, less sweat under woolen robes, and, in some cases, a little extra ventilation beneath those high stone ceilings. Elsewhere, some doctors, such as they were, began to recommend head shaving during outbreaks of disease. It was believed that hair could trap illness, or worse, that lice themselves carried the plague. When no one understood bacteria, shaving the head seemed like a solid medical plan. Did it work? Not really, but it felt clean, and sometimes the feeling mattered more than the science. Shaved heads became associated with control over the body, the mind, or one's place in the world. Kings ordered prisoners shaved before execution, nobles shaved before coronations. Soldiers shaved for discipline, and women, in rare cases, were shaved in public, as humiliation, as punishment, as a way of stripping power away. Hair was never just hair. To shave it was to declare something. I am clean. I am holy. I am conquered. I am reborn. In every culture, the bald head told a story, not of vanity, but of transformation, from body to symbol, from mess to order, from shame to status. And in a world where most people were covered in grime, wearing the same wool for weeks, and living beside open fires and open wounds, a smooth, clean scalp? That was the height of sophistication. Hair has always been more than just strands on a head. In many cultures, it holds power, symbolism, identity. And in the realm of religion, hair can become something sacred or something to surrender. For thousands of years, people have shaved their heads, not for fashion, but for faith. Let's begin with the monks. Across medieval Europe, Christian monks adopted a distinctive style called the tonsure, a circular patch of baldness on the crown of the head, surrounded by a ring of hair. It wasn't particularly flattering, but that wasn't the point. The tonsure was a sign of humility. It said, I have turned away from the world. I am no longer concerned with vanity or pride or the pleasures of appearance. I serve God. It also had practical benefits. Monasteries were not the cleanest places. With many men living closely together, often in wool robes and cold stone buildings, lice were a constant nuisance. Shaving helped. Not enough to get rid of them entirely, but enough to manage the scratching. The shape of the tonsure varied. Some monks shaved the whole top of the head. Others kept a small tuft, like a memory of hair still clinging to identity. In some orders, the shave was part of an initiation ritual. Your old self was gone. Your new, obedient self was beginning. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in ancient India and later across East Asia, Buddhist monks were also shaving their heads. But here, the act carried a different spiritual weight. To shave one's head in Buddhism was to renounce the material world. Hair was seen as a symbol of desire, attachment, and ego. By cutting it off, the monk or nun was cutting ties with illusion, vanity, and the craving that leads to suffering. New monks had their heads shaved in quiet ceremonies. Sometimes the act was repeated every few weeks as a reminder, let go again, let go more. The smooth scalp was not a statement of style, it was a visible, living vow. In Hindu traditions, shaving the head could also signify grief. After the death of a parent, a son might shave his head in mourning. The act became both a ritual of loss and a way to show respect to ancestors. In Islam, pilgrims on the Hajj to Mecca often shave their heads or cut a portion of their hair as part of the final rites. It's called tahallul, and it marks the completion of a sacred journey. For women, trimming just a small part of the hair is enough, but for men, a fully shaved head symbolizes purity, humility, and spiritual rebirth. Hair, in this way, becomes both personal and cosmic. It's something you grow, something you lose, something you offer. Even in ancient Japan, samurai and religious ascetics shared similar practices. Some warriors cut their hair to show they had left the battlefield, others shaved to enter temples. The act was solemn, deliberate, often silent. In all these cases, the shaving of the head was not about escaping dirt or lice, though that certainly helped. It was about changing your place in the world. From citizen to monk, from son to mourner, from traveller to pilgrim, from warrior to seeker. And when people didn't shave voluntarily, sometimes others did it for them. Across history, shaving the head has also been used as punishment, as humiliation, as a way to strip away status and pride. During certain wars, women accused of betrayal or collaboration were shaved in public. The meaning was reversed. What was once holy became shameful. But still, at its core, the act holds its power. There is something ancient about standing before a mirror or a blade and watching your hair fall. It is vulnerable. It is freeing. It is a quiet declaration that something is ending and something else is beginning. Whether in a monastery or on a pilgrimage path, whether for grief or growth, the clean scalp has always spoken softly. I am letting go. Today, long hair is often seen as a symbol of beauty. Flowing locks, glossy curls, hair that cascades like a waterfall, it all seems glamorous, desirable, timeless. But in the ancient and medieval world, long hair wasn't always beautiful. Sometimes it was inconvenient. Sometimes it was dangerous. And more often than not, it was simply dirty. Let's start with the basics. In the past, hair care wasn't easy. There were no conditioners, no detangling sprays, no satin pillowcases, no split-end repair. Hair was washed rarely, if ever, and usually with harsh or questionable substances like lye soap, vinegar, or ash. If you had long hair, it meant maintenance. It meant tangles. It meant knots that couldn't be brushed out, because brushes, if you had one, were made of bone or wood and not very gentle. Most people didn't want to deal with that. So, they tied their hair up, they braided it, they wrapped it, and often they covered it completely. In many societies, especially in medieval Europe and the Islamic world, women rarely let their hair show. They wore veils, hoods, or linen coifs. Not for modesty alone, but for protection. Protection from smoke, dust, lice, and fire. Open flames were everywhere, in kitchens, halls, temples. Long, loose hair was not poetic, it was flammable. So, hair was hidden, not styled, not shown, not admired from across the marketplace in a soft breeze. It was contained, controlled. For working women, practicality came first. Hair was kept off the face. Farmers, brewers, shepherdesses, they couldn't afford to have strands in their eyes, or in their soup. A braid tucked under a scarf was much safer than a romantic wave trailing behind. Even in noble households, The image of the long-haired lady brushing her tresses by candlelight is mostly a fantasy. Hair might be brushed, yes, but usually by a maid, with oil to keep it from matting. It wasn't about beauty. It was about avoiding insects and tangles. And for men, things were even less romantic. In medieval Europe, knights might grow their hair long beneath their helmets, but only because shaving was difficult and mirrors were rare. Their hair was often greasy, matted, or clumped with sweat after battle. In Viking culture, hair was admired, but still bound. Warriors tied their hair to avoid having it pulled in combat. Grooming was valued, yes, but not for beauty's sake, for dignity, for discipline. In other places, long hair on men became political. In early Qing China, as mentioned before, the queue hairstyle was enforced by law, half-shaved, half-braided. Refusing to wear it could result in death. So even if a man hated long hair, he wore it, because beauty had nothing to do with it. Across cultures, hair wasn't about style. It was about status, obedience, and ritual. And then there were the children. In many poor households, children had their heads shaved regularly, not to make them pretty, but to keep lice away. Cleanliness was more valuable than looks. Of course, long hair had meaning in some places. In many Native American traditions, long hair was spiritual, a connection to the earth, a sign of strength. In some African cultures, intricate braids told stories of tribe, age, or status. But even then, beauty was not the goal. Identity was. And beauty, as we define it today, was not always useful. In a world where water was scarce, illness common, and fire a constant threat, hair was simply another thing to manage, another source of risk. So, was long hair beautiful? Maybe, but not in the way we imagine it now, not in the shampoo commercial sense, not in the mirror-lit vanity way. It was often hidden, or tied, or trimmed, or shaved, not for fashion, but for survival. Beauty, back then, was quiet. It was health, clean skin, clear eyes, the ability to work, the absence of disease. Hair was not what made someone lovely. Character did, strength did, kindness, resilience. The idea that long hair equals beauty is a modern myth, woven perhaps by art and fantasy and filtered memory. Back then, long hair wasn't something to admire. It was something to deal with. Hair care today feels like a science. Bottles lined up neatly in the bathroom, shampoos with sea kelp, conditioners with avocado oil, serums with names you can't pronounce but trust completely. But in the ancient and medieval world, there was no such certainty. Hair care was an experiment, sometimes thoughtful, sometimes accidental, and sometimes unpleasant. Let's begin with the tools. There were no plastic combs or ceramic straighteners, no paddle brushes. Most people used what they had, or what someone could carve. Combs were often made of bone, wood, or horn. Some were beautifully etched with patterns, passed down like heirlooms. Others were simple, two flat pieces, carved with jagged teeth, meant to pull through knots or lice. Brushing hair wasn't about shine, it was about removal of dirt, bugs, and whatever had collected during the day. These combs were rarely washed. They lived in sleeves, satchels, or baskets. They gathered oils from every head they touched. And then there were the recipes. Hair washing solutions varied wildly, depending on time, place, and what ingredients were available. In parts of ancient Rome, women mixed ash with animal fat to cleanse the scalp. The fat acted like soap, while the ash gave it grit. The result? Slightly cleaner hair, and a lingering smell of smoke and mutton. In Viking settlements, some used egg yolks to condition their hair. Eggs were beaten and rubbed into the scalp, then rinsed with cold water. No one knew why it worked. But it left the hair softer, unless, of course, you cooked it in the sun by accident. Others turned to vinegar, apple cider, if they were lucky. Vinegar helped strip oils and kill lice, though it also left behind a sour cloud of scent. In some places, fermented urine was used. It sounds awful, and it was, but ammonia in old urine made it a powerful cleanser, used not only for hair, but for laundry and even teeth. In colder climates, where bathing was rare, people rubbed herbs into their hair. Lavender, rosemary, sage, not to clean it, but to mask the smell. Scent was everything. If you couldn't be clean, you could at least smell less bad. In ancient China, women sometimes boiled rice water and used it as a rinse. This practice, gentle and effective, softened the hair and gave it shine. It was one of the few routines that might still feel pleasant today. But not all ideas were gentle. In medieval Europe, one recipe for lice removal called for mercury mixed with pig lard, applied directly to the scalp. It may have worked, but slowly poisoned the user. Other mixtures involved crushed beetles, burnt onion skins, and even blood from lizards, depending on the superstition of the region. There were also powders, made from chalk, ground oyster shells, or dried flower petals. These were sprinkled onto the scalp and combed through, soaking up grease the way dry shampoo does today. The downside? A trail of powder on your shoulders, and often sneezing. For those who could afford it, hair oils became luxury items. In the Middle East, people blended almond oil, olive oil, and myrrh for nourishment. These oils were kept in tiny carved bottles, applied with fingers, and combed through slowly. But they went rancid easily. On warm days, your perfumed tresses might suddenly turn. The truth is, most people didn't expect their hair to look good. They expected it to behave, to stay out of their eyes, to not itch too much, to not get caught in their soup. Beauty was secondary to practicality, and risk was everywhere. One wrong recipe, and you ended up with burns, sores, or a very bad smell that lingered for weeks. Still, people tried. They rubbed things in, they rinsed with cold water, they combed, they plucked, they boiled strange herbs under the moon, and hoped the spirits of cleanliness would bless them. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Not the materials they used, but the desire to care, to feel fresh, to look in a cracked mirror and think, just a little better today. Even with bone combs, even with ashes, even with eggs. They did what they could, with what they had. In a world without mirrors, hair was not always about self-expression. It was about status. Who had time to care for their hair? Who had help? Who had clean hands, scented oils, silver combs? And who didn't? In most of the ancient and medieval world, hair care was a privilege, and it showed. Let's begin at the top. If you were noble, wealthy, or royal, your hair likely never touched your own hands. You had attendants, sometimes several, whose job it was to brush, braid, and manage your hair each morning. These grooming rituals could take hours, with combs carved from bone or ivory, warmed oils, and gentle detangling, done by someone else, of course. In noble courts, hair was political. A queen's braid could be a symbol of fertility. A king's beard might represent wisdom or divine right. A princess's long tresses could become a marriage asset. Hair was image, and image was power. But even among the elite, not everyone had the same luxury. Young girls might wear their hair down, as a symbol of youth and purity. Married women covered it, tightly coiled and hidden beneath veils or caps. Long, uncovered hair on a married woman was sometimes seen as inappropriate. Loose hair meant a loose reputation. The higher your status, the less visible your hair often became. Meanwhile, in the lower classes, hair was practical. There were no attendants, no perfumes, no time. Peasants, field workers, brewers, washerwomen, they tied their hair back or cut it short. Long hair got in the way of labor. It dipped into soup, caught in spinning wheels, or attracted lice from animals. So they shaved it, or cropped it, or tied it tightly under kerchiefs, unseen, unwashed, and uncelebrated. For men, the story wasn't so different. Noblemen had barbers, either personal or public. Their hair was shaped to match fashion or military role. Beards came and went with dynasties. Haircuts were statements. But if you were a farmer or soldier, your hair had a different story. It kept you warm in winter, itchy in summer, and always carried the smells of your labor. There were no barbers in the field. Just a knife and a helping hand, if you were lucky. And then there were slaves and servants. In many societies, they had no control over their hair at all. It was cut as punishment, as identification, or as routine. Some were shaved to show their position. Others were forced to wear specific hairstyles by their masters. Hair became a mark of ownership, a way to strip someone of choice. In some cultures, certain hairstyles were forbidden to lower classes. In ancient China and feudal Japan, laws regulated who could wear elaborate buns or decorate their hair with pins. Breaking the rule could mean arrest, or worse. And yet, hair was never just about class. It was also about labor. If your life was lived in dirt, sweat, and fire, your hair was a liability. It held soot from the hearth, pollen from the fields, and sometimes blood from the animals you worked beside. To be shaved wasn't always shameful. It was efficient. Some women, especially widows or healers, shaved their heads to signal spiritual devotion. Others did it out of necessity. With no money for oil, no time for grooming, and no one to help, a shaved head meant one less task to worry about. Still, the image remained. Those with hair were served. Those without it served others. Hair could be curled, perfumed, and adorned, or hidden, hacked, and ignored. It depended not on beauty, but on power. In palaces, combs were made of silver and used daily. In villages, they were shared, chipped, and used when lice got too bold. Hair was a mirror of your place in the world. The more control you had over it, the more control you likely had over your life. So while a noblewoman sat near a hearth, sipping wine while her maid oiled her braids, another woman, in another place, cut hers off with a dull blade, then went back to work. Before fashion weeks, before influencers, before shampoo and hairdryers, there were wigs. Big ones, heavy ones, beautiful, scented, decorated ones. And in many places, they weren't just accessories. They were status. They were power. They were sometimes stolen. Let's go back, far back, to ancient Egypt. In the burning heat of the Nile Valley, elite Egyptians often shaved their heads for hygiene and comfort, but baldness wasn't fashionable, so they wore wigs. Carefully crafted from human hair, palm fibers, or wool, these wigs came in all shapes and sizes, braided, curled, beaded, even perfumed. They weren't just for looks, they were ritual objects. Wigs were worn in ceremonies, funerals, and religious festivals. To be seen in public without one, if you were upper class, was unthinkable, like leaving the house barefoot and naked. They also smelled good. Small cones of scented wax were sometimes placed on top, melting slowly in the sun and dripping fragrance into the wig, the scalp, and the air around. But not everyone could afford one. A well-made wig was expensive, and good human hair was even more valuable than gold, which meant wigs, even in ancient times, were targets for theft. Fast forward to Rome. Wealthy Roman women adored wigs, especially ones made from blonde hair, imported from conquered Germanic tribes. Wearing barbarian hair became a fashion statement, a symbol of reach, wealth, and worldliness. There were entire markets where wigs were bought and sold, some made from the hair of slaves, others from prisoners, or people desperate enough to trade their locks for coins. As the Roman Empire declined, wig culture faded, but centuries later, it came back with a vengeance. Enter 17th century Europe and the age of powdered wigs. In France, England, and across aristocratic courts, wigs exploded in size, height, and importance. First popularized by King Louis XIV of France to cover his balding head, wigs soon became a requirement of high society. You weren't dressed without one. And they weren't subtle. Some wigs were over 2 feet tall, made of tightly curled human hair, horsehair, or goat wool. They were powdered with flour mixed with starch, sometimes tinted with lavender or rose. White became the most fashionable color, symbolizing cleanliness, refinement, and nobility. But they were also vulnerable. Wigs were incredibly expensive. They required constant maintenance, cleaning, repowdering, even rewiring. Wealthy nobles had special wig rooms. Some had dedicated wig servants. A full set of wigs could be worth more than a year's wages for a laborer. So, unsurprisingly, wigs began to disappear. A black market emerged in cities like Paris and London. Thieves known as wig snatchers, or hair hunters, specialized in stealing wigs, sometimes from shops, sometimes from the heads of sleeping people. They used long hooks to pull wigs off in crowds. Some women slept with cages around their heads to protect their prized hair pieces. There are reports of carriages being robbed, not for jewelry, but for the wigs inside. Wigs weren't just fashion, they were a form of currency. And for those living on the edges of society, a stolen wig could mean food, warmth, or escape. Even beyond theft, there was a darker side. Many wigs were made from hair collected in unpleasant ways. Prisoners, orphans, and slaves were often shaved without consent. Some people sold their hair willingly, but others had no choice. Wearing a wig meant wearing someone else's story. Sometimes a story of survival, sometimes a story of loss. But in the end, the wig told the world who you were, or who you wanted to appear to be. It said, "I am clean, I am rich, I belong here." And for those who couldn't afford one, they stared, they dreamed, or they stole. Because in a world where real hair was hard to care for and fake hair could change your fate, wigs became more than decoration. They were armor, they were identity, they were the ultimate luxury. And sometimes, the easiest thing to lose. Throughout history, people shaved their heads for many reasons. For fashion, for ritual, for control. But sometimes, they shaved to survive. In the centuries before antibiotics, microscopes, or public health, disease was a constant presence. It drifted through crowded cities. It lingered in villages. It followed armies and merchants and priests. And people noticed something. Where there was hair, there were problems. During outbreaks of plague, fever, or mysterious illness, many believed that hair, especially long unwashed hair, trapped disease, that it soaked up the bad air, that it held the poison of sickness close to the skin. And so, the razors came out. Doctors, or those who claimed to be doctors, began recommending head shaving as a treatment. It wasn't based on science as we know it now, but on observation, fear, and desperation. They saw lice crawling through unwashed heads. They saw fevers rise in filthy quarters. And they thought, perhaps cutting the hair will cut the danger. In many plague-struck towns, barbers became emergency health workers. They didn't just trim beards. They performed bloodletting, extracted teeth, and shaved the heads of the sick and the soon-to-be sick. Sometimes, whole families were shaved before being sealed inside their homes during quarantine. The act was meant to clean, to purify, to give the body a better chance. Of course, it didn't always work. But sometimes, it felt like control. In monasteries and military camps, where people lived close together, infestations of lice, fleas, and mites were common. These tiny creatures didn't just itch, they carried disease. Typhus, relapsing fever, trench fever, all spread through parasites that loved the warmth of human hair. So soldiers, monks, and prisoners often had their heads shaved. It wasn't about beauty, it wasn't about dignity, it was about minimizing risk and being ready for the worst. During the Black Death in Europe, rumors spread that the plague could be carried in hair, that your hair held the death inside. Some people burned their hair, others soaked it in vinegar or urine. Some chopped it all off and threw it into rivers, hoping the current would carry away the sickness. In 18th century hospitals, some nurses shaved the heads of incoming patients automatically, just in case. A bald scalp was easier to monitor, easier to cool down with cloths, easier to clean. And, in dark irony, easier to leave behind if the patient didn't survive. Even in more recent centuries, head shaving has appeared during epidemics. In some 19th century asylums and orphanages, children had their heads shaved to prevent lice outbreaks. It was faster than washing, cheaper than combing. And it gave the illusion of health, even in places where suffering was everywhere. But shaving didn't only protect the living, it prepared the dying. In cultures around the world, from medieval Europe to parts of India and Southeast Asia, shaving the head became a final act of cleansing, a ritual of letting go, a way to send the soul onward, unburdened. And sometimes, it was the family, not the sick, who shaved their own heads, in grief, in mourning, in symbolic solidarity. Hair, so tied to identity, was removed, as if to say, nothing is certain, not even this. Even today, echoes of this logic remain. In hospitals, patients preparing for surgery have their heads shaved. In war zones, shaving a comrade's head might mean preparing them for treatment or for burial. In prisons, hair is removed to prevent lice, violence, or escape. Shaving the head is still a sign, sometimes of fear, sometimes of courage, always of change. It tells the world that something has shifted. That comfort has been sacrificed. That survival is now the goal. Long ago, people shaved not to look strong, but to stay alive. Not to stand out, but to endure. Because when the world turned dark with fever, and the body trembled with sweat, sometimes the only thing left to do was take a blade to the scalp and hope. Hair has always followed us, through history, through myth, through the dust and fire of daily life. It's easy to look back and laugh at strange recipes, bone combs or wigs so tall they brushed the ceiling. But behind every braid, every shave, every clump of tangled strands, there was a person. A life, a choice, or a lack of one. Some shaved their heads to survive. Some hid their hair to obey. Some covered it with cloth, with wigs, with oil and prayer. Some never had the time to think about it at all. In the ancient world, hair was rarely about beauty alone. It was about status, about cleanliness, or the appearance of it, about ritual, protection, and power. To have your hair combed each morning by someone else meant you belonged to a higher class. To shave it meant illness, mourning, transformation, or control. And to wear someone else's hair on your head was, at times, the ultimate luxury or the ultimate lie. Hair has been a crown, a weight, a vow, a silence. It holds scent, memory, ceremony. It grows, it falls, it returns. And though we now have shampoos and serums, salons and sprays, that ancient truth remains. Hair is never just hair. It is a quiet record of how we lived, and what we were willing to do, to survive, to serve, to stand out, or simply to stay clean. So tonight, as you lay your head down, know this: the people of the past were not so different. They scratched, they washed, they hoped, they whispered, over tangled locks and razors, the same silent question we still ask ourselves. Do I look all right? Am I all right? Will this help me make it through another day? And sometimes the answer was yes, even if all they had was a comb of bone and the will to keep going.